It was a busy Saturday morning in a small-town diner, the kind of place where everyone knew each other by sight, if not by name. The air smelled faintly of coffee and sizzling bacon, mixed with the sweet scent of pancakes on the griddle. The sound of clinking plates, murmured conversations, and the occasional laugh created a comfortable, almost familiar chaos that made the diner feel alive. In the middle of it all, she moved with practiced ease, carrying trays and taking orders, her steps confident despite the stares and whispers that occasionally followed her path. She had been working at the diner for several years. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly didn't pay much, but she liked the rhythm of it, the way she could move through the crowded space and know exactly where everything was. Customers came and went, some polite, some rude, some indifferent, but she had learned to handle them all. Some days were harder than others, and some mornings, like this one, tested her patience. On this particular morning, a group of people walked in, loud and confident. They were dressed neatly, the kind of people who carried themselves with a sense of entitlement. They took a booth near the window, immediately drawing attention. Not because they were remarkable in any way, but because they seemed to expect the world to notice them. She approached their table with a smile, ready to take their order, trying to keep her tone light and friendly as she did with every customer. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" she asked. The leader of the group glanced at her, his eyes flicking briefly over her face before settling on the table. "I don't even know if I want to deal with you," he said casually, as if she hadn't heard. His words were sharp, but his tone carried a sense of amusement. She swallowed her immediate reaction, forced herself to keep smiling, and tried again. "Well, I'll be happy to help you with anything on the menu." Another person at the table leaned back, smirking. "You know, it's kind of hard to take someone seriously with that on their face," he said, pointing in a vague motion. She knew exactly what he meant. Her scars, they were old, long-healed, but still visible. A part of her she had lived with every day. She had learned to accept them, to wear them as a reminder of her resilience. But she also knew that not everyone had the decency to keep their comments to themselves. She took a slow, steady breath, forcing her hands to remain steady as she set the menu down. "I'll just take your order whenever you're ready," she said, keeping her voice calm. The group laughed, low unpleasant sound that made her stomach twist. They didn't see her as a person, not really. To them, she was just something to comment on, an object of their amusement. They didn't notice her years of hard work, the way she had cared for her family, or the quiet strength it took to get through life with dignity despite what people said. She moved away from the table, trying to focus on the other customers, to let the laughter and whispers roll off her like water off a duck's back. But it lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Every time she glanced back, she saw them looking at her, pointing, smirking, making small, cruel gestures that were meant to wound. Other people in the diner noticed. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent. Some whispered to each other, glancing at the table and then at her. But no one intervened. It was one of those moments where cruelty felt acceptable simply because no one was challenging it. She kept working, keeping her movements smooth and precise. She carried a tray of eggs and toast to another table, smiled at a child who waved at her, and filled coffee cups for a couple who had been coming to the diner for years. She reminded herself that these were the moments that mattered, the people who valued her, not the ones who tried to tear her down. But the group wasn't done. One of them leaned forward, lowering his voice, though not enough to hide it from anyone nearby. "I mean, look at that," he said. "Who even leaves the house looking like that?" His words were casual, almost careless, but they hit her like a slap. She froze for a moment, heart pounding, hands tightening around the coffee pot she had been holding. It would have been so easy to break down, to lash out, to tell them off. But she didn't. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, at least not in the heat of the moment. She poured the coffee carefully, making sure not to spill a drop, and placed it in front of the customer without a word. She could feel the eyes on her back as she moved away, the weight of their judgment pressing down, but she forced herself to stand tall. She reminded herself of the people she loved, the friends who had supported her. The strangers who had smiled at her on harder days. She reminded herself that their words didn't define her, didn't tell the story of who she was or what she had endured. Still, it hurt. The kind of hurt that didn't fade immediately, the kind that lingered in the pit of the stomach and the ache of the chest. She felt the familiar sting of old memories, moments when people had looked at her differently, moments when she had been made to feel less than she was. She pushed the feelings down, buried them beneath a layer of professionalism and composure, and moved on to the next task. It was then that she noticed a man sitting at the counter watching the whole scene unfold. He was older, with a presence that seemed calm yet commanding. He didn't say anything, just observed, quietly sipping his coffee. There was something about the way he looked at her, something that made her pause for a second. It wasn't judgment or amusement. It was recognition, understanding, quiet acknowledgement that she was more than what the others saw. She shook her head slightly, trying to focus on the orders in front of her. But the feeling lingered, a small spark of hope amid the tension. She had learned to survive these moments, to keep moving even when the world seemed determined to put her down. And somehow, in that brief glance from the man at the counter, she felt that maybe, just maybe, someone saw her for who she truly was. As the morning went on, the diner continued to fill. Plates clattered, coffee steamed, and the smell of food mixed with the hum of conversation. She moved from table to table, taking orders, delivering meals, and listening to the occasional story from regulars who felt like family. She smiled, laughed when appropriate, and kept her movements precise. Her mind focused on the work rather than the cruelty that had tried to define her morning. The group at the window eventually grew bored, their laughter and whispers fading as they finished their meal. They left without a word to her, tossing money on the table and walking out with the same sense of entitlement they had carried in when they arrived. The relief that followed was immediate, a weight lifting from her shoulders, but it didn't erase the sting entirely. It was the kind of experience that lingered, a reminder that the world could be harsh, cruel, and unfair. She returned to the counter, took a deep breath, and allowed herself a brief moment to gather her thoughts. She reminded herself that she had survived worse. She had faced challenges far greater than a few rude strangers in a diner. She reminded herself that her scars were a part of her story, a testament to her resilience, a visible reminder of battles fought and won. The man at the counter continued to watch her, and this time he nodded slightly, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. It was a recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that she was not defined by the cruelty of others, that she carried strength and dignity that went beyond appearances. She caught his eye and offered a small smile, a silent exchange that felt like a lifeline amid the tension of the morning. For the rest of the day, she carried herself with renewed determination. The memory of the group at the window faded into the background, replaced by the rhythm of work, the interactions with kind customers, and the quiet understanding that she was not alone. She knew there were people who saw her, who appreciated her, and who understood the courage it took to face the world every day. And in that small-town diner, amid the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation, she continued to move forward, carrying herself with the grace and resilience that had carried her through every challenge. She was more than her scars, more than the cruelty of strangers, more than the judgments of those who failed to see her humanity. She was a woman who had endured, who had survived, and who would continue to rise. No matter what the world tried to throw at her, she wiped her hands on her apron. Feeling the warmth of the coffee cup she had just set down, the diner had settled into a quiet rhythm after the chaotic morning. The regulars chatting softly, the clatter of plates and cutlery still present, but no longer overwhelming. She took a deep breath, trying to push away the memory of the rude group at the window. Their words still lingered in her mind, gnawing at the edges of her confidence. But she refused to let them define her as she moved toward the kitchen to refill a pitcher of water. She felt a presence behind the counter. The man who had been watching her earlier was still there, sitting quietly at the far end of the diner. There was something calm and steady about him, a quiet strength that made him seem different from the other customers who came and went without notice. She couldn't explain why. She felt a sense of reassurance just seeing him there. He watched her with an intensity that was not uncomfortable, but instead felt protective, almost like someone who had seen the world and knew how to read people quickly. She carried on with her work, pouring water, wiping tables, and checking on customers. But she found herself stealing glances at him when she could. He wasn't intrusive, not at all. He just observed quietly, and it made her wonder what had brought him to this diner on a quiet Saturday morning. The group that had insulted her had long since left, and yet their laughter seemed to echo faintly in her mind. She reminded herself that their opinions were meaningless. She had lived through much worse, faced far greater challenges, had learned to endure without letting cruelty define her. But even with all that experience, there were moments when the sting of unfairness cut deep. Moments when she wished someone would see her for who she really was, that someone might be this man at the counter. She noticed the way he sat, relaxed yet alert, scanning the diner with sharp, thoughtful eyes. He wasn't just looking at the room. He was looking at her, and she felt a strange mix of curiosity and relief. It was as if he recognized something in her, something that went beyond appearances, something that most people overlooked. She moved back toward the tables, delivering orders and refilling drinks, but she felt a quiet tension under the surface. The world could be cruel, and she had learned that lesson early. She had learned to carry herself with dignity even when no one appreciated it, to smile even when her heart felt heavy, to respond with patience even when others chose rudeness. And yet, the presence of the man at the counter made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. He didn't say anything, but there was a sense of awareness in his eyes that made her stop for a moment. He didn't judge her scars, didn't whisper or smirk, didn't treat her like an object to ridicule. He simply looked, and in that look was acknowledgement, respect, and understanding. She had spent her life being underestimated, being overlooked. And yet here was someone who seemed to notice the strength. She carried quietly inside her. The diner continued its rhythm around them. A couple came in and ordered breakfast. A child laughed at a joke from their parent. The cook called out a timer from the kitchen. She moved among the tables, polite and professional, but her mind kept drifting back to him. There was a quiet curiosity, a hope, and maybe even a little relief in knowing that not everyone in the world judged her by her scars. She had learned over time that people often reacted to what they saw rather than who she was. Her scars told a story of survival, resilience, and strength. But most people didn't have the patience or empathy to understand that. They saw only what was visible and assumed they knew everything. It was exhausting to constantly navigate the assumptions, the judgments, and the occasional cruelty. And yet she persisted. She had to. For herself, for the people she cared about, for the life she wanted to live. As she approached the counter with a fresh cup of coffee for a customer, the man at the far end nodded slightly, a small gesture that was almost imperceptible but carried a weight that she couldn't ignore. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it felt profound. Someone had noticed her. Someone understood. She allowed herself a small smile in return, though she quickly returned to her work, careful not to let anyone see the cracks in her composure. The morning passed slowly but steadily. She moved from table to table, greeted regulars with familiarity, and answered questions about the menu. She noticed the subtle ways people treated her differently, depending on their mood or assumptions. Some smiled genuinely, some pretended to be polite, and some simply ignored her presence. It was a world she had learned to navigate with grace, even when it felt unfair or unkind. Meanwhile, the man at the counter remained quietly observing. Never intruding, but clearly aware of the interactions unfolding around him. He didn't need to speak to make his presence known. There was a weight to him, a sense that he understood more than he let on. She found herself wondering about his story, imagining the experiences that might have shaped the quiet authority he carried. When the lunch crowd began to trickle in, the diner grew busier and she had to move faster. Balancing trays, taking orders, and refilling drinks with the efficiency that came from years of experience. The chaos was familiar, almost comforting, because it demanded her attention and left little room for dwelling on unpleasant memories. Still, the thought of the earlier insults lingered. a faint ache that reminded her of the fragility of patience and the endurance required to maintain dignity under scrutiny. At one point, a young family came in, and the child stared openly at her scars, curiosity evident on their face. She knelt slightly to greet them, offering a warm smile and a kind word. The child smiled back, and she felt a small spark of joy, a reminder that innocence often saw beyond appearances. It was moments like these that reminded her why she continued to work here, why she persisted despite the occasional cruelty. She could make a difference in small ways, and sometimes that was enough. The man at the counter took notice, and she sensed his approval, though he didn't say a word. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes, a recognition of the strength it took to continue with grace in the face of judgment. She had lived with her scars for so long, had faced so many who misunderstood or mocked her, that having someone silently acknowledge her resilience felt like a balm to a wound that had never fully healed. As the day wore on, she found herself reflecting on her life, her challenges and her quiet victories. She remembered the early mornings, the late nights, the people who had doubted her, the moments when she had proven herself not to them, but to herself. Every scar, every hardship, every moment of endurance had shaped her, made her stronger, and given her a perspective few others could understand. Yet, despite all her resilience, she couldn't ignore the sting of the morning's insults. They were a reminder that cruelty could appear anywhere, at any time, and that maintaining dignity required constant effort. It was tiring, sometimes overwhelming, but it was part of the life she had chosen, a life of service, patience, and quiet perseverance. By mid-afternoon, the diner had settled into a quieter lull. She wiped down tables, refilled condiments, and checked on customers, her movements precise and efficient. The man at the counter was still there, finishing his coffee slowly, reading a newspaper. Yet always aware of her presence, she wondered again about his story, about what had brought him here, and whether he had noticed the cruelty she had endured that morning when a delivery arrived. She helped carry boxes into the kitchen, feeling the physical effort as a welcome distraction from the emotional weight of the day. She reminded herself that work was grounding. That movement and focus could drown out negative thoughts, and that she had survived far greater challenges than rude strangers in a diner. Throughout it all, she felt the quiet presence of the man at the counter, a silent witness to her strength and endurance. It was strange, comforting, and a little unsettling all at once. She didn't know his story, didn't know why he seemed to understand her, but she felt a spark of hope that not everyone in the world judged her by appearances or overlooked her courage. As the afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the diner, she felt a renewed sense of determination. The morning's cruelty would not define her day. She would continue to work with grace, to interact with kindness, and to hold her head high. There were people who mattered, moments that counted, and a strength within her that no one could take away. She glanced toward the counter again and saw him nod slightly, a gesture that seemed to say, without words, that he understood, that he respected her, that he recognized the resilience she carried quietly within herself. It was a moment of silent connection, a reminder that even in a world that could be harsh and unkind, there were people who saw the truth of her character by the time the diner began to slow for the late afternoon. She had found a rhythm, a quiet confidence that had eluded her in the morning. She moved through the tables with ease, spoke to customers with warmth, and allowed herself small moments of satisfaction in knowing that she had endured, had maintained her dignity, and had continued to serve with grace. And all the while, the man at the counter remained, a silent observer, a quiet acknowledgement that she was more than the scars others had mocked, more than the judgment of strangers, and more than the fleeting cruelty of the world. He seemed to understand her in a way few people ever had, and that understanding, though unspoken, gave her a small but meaningful sense of validation, a reminder that strength and dignity were always worth preserving. The diner had entered its slow, late-afternoon rhythm. The clatter of plates had diminished, conversations had softened, and the warm sunlight streaming through the windows painted a golden glow on the tables. She moved between the booths with calm efficiency, clearing plates, refilling drinks, and checking on her customers, but the memory of the morning's insult still pressed quietly at the edges of her mind. Every time she thought of the group that had mocked her, she felt a small tightness in her chest, a reminder of how quickly people could be cruel without consequence. Her steps were steady, her voice light as she greeted the few lingering customers. She had long ago learned to mask her discomfort with a practiced smile, to make politeness appear effortless even when her patience was being tested. The diner was her stage, and she had mastered her performance, attentive, patient, and cheerful. Even when faced with moments of humiliation, the man at the counter remained in his seat. He had moved slightly closer to the window, his posture relaxed, yet there was a quiet awareness in his gaze. He didn't intrude, didn't comment, didn't make any sudden movements that would draw attention, but she could feel him watching, not in a judgmental way, but in a manner that felt protective, thoughtful, almost as if he were assessing not just her actions but her character. She had seen people watch before, but this was different. This was not the scrutiny of someone who looked for weakness. It was the observation of someone who recognized strength. Even when it was quiet and unassuming, she found herself stealing small glances at him whenever she could. Curious about who he was, why he seemed so attuned to her presence. Something about him felt familiar in a way she couldn't place. It wasn't the way he looked, it was the energy he carried. There was an unspoken understanding in the way he held himself, a kind of calm authority that suggested he had seen more of the world than most, that he had endured and survived things that left others wary or cautious. A family of 3 entered the diner. Just as she was setting down a plate of pancakes for another customer, she greeted them warmly, guiding them to a booth and handing them menus with a practiced cheerfulness. The child, small and curious, stared at her scars for a moment before looking away, unsure whether to ask about them. She smiled at the child gently, kneeling slightly to make herself more approachable, and spoke in a light, friendly tone. The parents watched, smiling at her kindness, and she felt a small lift in her heart, a reminder that even the smallest acts of patience and humanity could make a difference. As she returned to the counter to pick up an order, she noticed the man at the counter subtly observing the family. His eyes were sharp, and though he didn't speak, there was a quiet acknowledgement in his gaze, almost as if he was silently approving her approach, noticing her care and empathy. She felt a strange comfort in that observation. It was a reminder that someone was noticing her for more than just the surface. For more than the scars that strangers had mocked that morning, she moved to the kitchen to pick up another order, balancing a tray filled with plates. Her hands were steady, her movements precise, but her mind was alert, aware of the lingering presence of the group that had insulted her earlier. They were gone physically, but their words still had a shadow over the day, subtle reminder that cruelty could appear without warning. She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on her rhythm, on the work in front of her, on the small victories of polite exchanges and smiling customers. The man at the counter shifted slightly, and she caught a glimpse of a small notebook in his hand. He was writing something, though she couldn't see what. Her curiosity flickered. Who was he, and why did he seem so quietly invested in the events of the diner? She shook her head slightly and returned to her work, reminding herself that she didn't need to know everyone's story to continue hers, but the sense that he understood something about her, something she hadn't even shared, lingered like a quiet warmth. Suddenly, one of the remaining customers made a comment about the earlier group, not directed at her, but loud enough for her to hear. "I can't believe people can be that rude," they said, shaking their head. She smiled politely, grateful for the acknowledgement, but kept her distance. She didn't need pity or sympathy. She needed respect and recognition of her humanity. She had lived long enough to understand the difference. She moved back toward the window, clearing an empty booth, and found herself again glancing at the man. He had set his notebook aside and was now simply observing, his gaze steady and calm. Something about that gaze made her feel less alone, less exposed to the judgment of the world. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier, to let a small sense of relief seep in. As the afternoon light shifted, she felt a subtle change in the atmosphere of the diner. The lunch rush had ended, leaving behind a quiet, almost reflective mood. People were lingering, sipping coffee slowly, reading, talking in soft tones. The harshness of the morning had faded, but its memory lingered like a shadow. She continued her work, taking care of the few remaining customers, moving with efficiency and grace, but the thought of the insults still lingered, a reminder of how quickly humanity could fail to be kind. She paused for a moment, setting down a plate, and allowed herself to reflect on the past. Memories of other moments, of other challenges, of other instances where people had judged her before they knew her, came rushing briefly. Each memory was a reminder of the resilience she had built over the years, the quiet strength that had carried her through moments of misunderstanding, mockery, and neglect. Her scars, once a source of shame and self-consciousness, had become symbols of endurance, badges of survival in a world that often failed to acknowledge her courage. The man at the counter noticed her pause and gave a small nod, subtle but unmistakable. It was not patronizing, not dismissive, but a gesture that seemed to say, "I see you. I understand." She felt a flicker of warmth at that acknowledgement. It was remarkable how a small gesture, so quiet and unassuming, could carry such profound weight. In that moment, she realized how much she had craved understanding, recognition, in the simple acknowledgement of her humanity. As she moved to refill the sugar container for a customer, she thought about how often people overlooked the struggles of those around them. Cruelty, she knew, was often born from ignorance. People mocked what they didn't understand, assumed what they hadn't experienced, and judged what they hadn't taken the time to see. She had experienced this her whole life, yet she had learned to respond not with anger but with patience and resilience. She had learned to rise above the small cruelties, to focus on the people who mattered, and to find strength in the quiet moments of connection and understanding. The man at the counter had become a quiet anchor throughout the day. His presence, steady and observant, reminded her that there were people in the world who did see beyond appearances, who did notice effort, courage, and the quiet persistence of someone who refused to be diminished by the cruelty of others. She found herself wondering about him, imagining the experiences that had shaped him, the wisdom that came from facing life's challenges with calm resolve. She returned to the kitchen for another order and noticed one of the cooks glancing toward the man at the counter. They shared a brief, knowing look, almost conspiratorial, before returning to their tasks. She didn't know what to make of it, but it added to the sense that there was more going on beneath the surface than she could see. Somehow she felt that this man, quiet and watchful, had a connection to her that went beyond a simple act of observation. As the afternoon continued, the diner slowly emptied. The sunlight waned, casting long shadows across the tables. She cleaned and organized, refilled condiments, and made sure every table was ready for the evening crowd. The weight of the morning's insult had lessened, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment and resilience. She had maintained her dignity, served with grace, and carried herself with patience despite the cruelty she had endured. Finally, she had a moment to pause. She leaned against the counter, hands resting lightly, and allowed herself to observe the diner. It was a simple place, ordinary in every way, yet it held a rhythm and a life all its own. The faint hum of conversation, the clinking of dishes, the subtle aroma of coffee and fried eggs, it all felt grounding. A reminder that life continued even after moments of pain and insult. The man at the counter remained, still watching quietly. There was a calmness to his presence, a sense of attentiveness that felt almost protective. He had not spoken, yet his awareness of her and the events around her carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. She felt a quiet gratitude for his presence, even without understanding it fully. As the evening approached and the diner prepared for the dinner crowd, she felt a subtle shift in her own mindset. The morning's cruelty, though painful, had been tempered by small moments of kindness, acknowledgement, and understanding. The child who smiled at her, the customers who appreciated her patience, and the quiet presence of the man at the counter had all contributed to a sense that she was not alone, that her efforts, strength, and resilience mattered, even if only to a few. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to feel a spark of hope. It was small, quiet, almost fragile, but it was there. and she realized that hope could be nurtured, even in a world that often seemed unfair. That strength could be recognized, even when others chose to mock or belittle. That dignity, quietly maintained, had value. Even when it went unnoticed by most, she straightened, adjusted her apron, and returned to her tasks with renewed focus. The diner continued its rhythm, the evening approaching, and she moved among the tables with calm determination. The presence of the man at the counter, quiet yet steady, served as a reminder that her efforts were seen, her courage acknowledged, and her dignity intact. The diner had begun to empty as the afternoon faded into evening. The sunlight turned softer, casting long streaks across the floor and giving the room a warm, golden glow. She moved through the tables, clearing empty plates, refilling cups, and wiping down surfaces. Her movements were smooth and practiced, but there was a quiet tension beneath her calm exterior. She felt the lingering weight of the morning's insults, and yet, in that same space, there was an unspoken sense that something had shifted. The man at the counter had not left. He had been there all day, quietly observing, never intruding, never speaking. Yet his presence carried a calm authority that was impossible to ignore. She felt it as a subtle pull, a quiet reassurance that someone was seeing her, not the surface, not the scars, not the judgments, but the person she truly was. It was a sensation she had longed for without realizing it. A quiet recognition of her resilience and dignity as she moved toward a table to refill a coffee cup. Her hands steadied instinctively, but her mind was alert. The morning's insults had left a mark, a reminder of how careless cruelty could be. She had endured far worse, faced judgment in many forms, but each instance left a small, lingering ache. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on her work. On the small moments that mattered, the child who smiled at her, the couple who nodded in thanks. The rhythm of her movements that allowed the diner to function smoothly even in chaos. It was then that the man at the counter finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, not loud, not intrusive, but it carried a weight that made her pause. "You have more strength than most people notice," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. She froze for a moment, her hand resting on the edge of the table she was wiping. The words were simple, but they resonated deeply. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Not in all the years she had worked in diners, endured insults, or carried herself with quiet determination. She glanced at him, uncertain, a flicker of curiosity and caution in her eyes. He smiled faintly, not smugly, not arrogantly, but with an understanding that seemed to reach across the distance between them. "I saw what happened earlier," he said, nodding toward the window. "The way they treated you. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. But it doesn't define you." Her chest tightened slightly, a mixture of surprise and relief. She had expected judgment, distance, or indifference, but not understanding. His words were not sympathy. They were acknowledgement. They were recognition of the courage it had taken to continue moving forward when the world had tried to belittle her. She swallowed, feeling the sting of emotion, and forced herself to reply, keeping her voice steady. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've learned to deal with people like that. It's not easy, but it's part of the job." He nodded, his eyes steady. "It's more than that," he said. "It's who you are. And I know exactly who you are." Words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. There was a pause, a moment where the hum of the diner seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet between them. She blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I've seen you before," he said, leaning slightly forward. "Years ago, at a community event for people who had faced challenges, you were volunteering. You helped so many, quietly, without expecting recognition. I remember because it made an impression on me. I've never forgotten it." She felt a rush of disbelief, then a slow warming of recognition. She remembered the long hours, the people she had tried to help. The quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference, even when no one else noticed. She had never expected anyone to remember her, especially not someone she had never spoken to beyond that brief interaction. And yet here he was, telling her that he did. "I didn't realize anyone noticed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It felt strange to hear someone acknowledge her efforts after so long, to have someone see her beyond the surface of her scars, beyond the assumptions of strangers. "It was nothing," she added, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "It wasn't nothing," he replied firmly. "It mattered. You mattered. And today I watched what happened, and I wanted you to know that someone sees the truth of who you are, not just what people think of you." His tone was calm, steady, and completely genuine. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. Truly seen. Her mind raced as she processed his words. She had spent years carrying herself with dignity, often in silence. Often in spaces where no one appreciated the effort it took. She had faced judgment, mockery, and indifference, yet she had persisted. And now, in this quiet diner, after a morning of humiliation, someone had recognized that strength. Someone had remembered her past kindness, her resilience, and her courage. Tears threatened to spill, and she quickly blinked them back. She wasn't used to being vulnerable, wasn't used to having her strength acknowledged so openly. She wanted to say something more, to express the gratitude and relief she felt, but the words seemed insufficient. "Thank you," she said again, her voice catching slightly. I appreciate you saying that," he nodded, his expression calm, almost fatherly in its reassurance. "I mean it. You've carried yourself through a lot, and you've done it with dignity. Most people wouldn't notice, but I did. And I wanted you to know that it doesn't go unseen." She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mix of relief, gratitude, and disbelief. Someone had acknowledged her courage, her quiet resilience, and her humanity in a world that so often failed to see her. She had worked hard to maintain her dignity, and for the first time that day, she felt that effort validated, recognized, and appreciated. The diner around them continued its rhythm. The few remaining customers chatting softly, the faint clatter of plates in the kitchen, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. Yet for her, the world had narrowed to that quiet space between herself and the man at the counter. There was no judgment, no ridicule, only recognition, understanding, and an unspoken respect. I didn't expect this," she admitted quietly, almost to herself. "After everything that happened this morning, I didn't expect anyone to." Notice, he shook his head slightly, a small smile on his face. "That's the thing about people who matter," he said. "They notice, even when no one else does. Even when the world tries to ignore it, someone always remembers. Someone always sees." She swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. He was right. All those years of effort, all those quiet acts of kindness, all the moments she had persisted despite judgment and cruelty, they mattered. Someone had seen. Someone had remembered. Someone had acknowledged the person she was, not the assumptions others had made about her. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to relax. She had been carrying the tension, the sting of insult, the weight of unacknowledged effort for hours. And now, in this quiet moment, she felt at ease slightly. It was not gone entirely. She knew life would continue to present challenges, but it was tempered by recognition, by understanding, by the knowledge that someone saw her truth. The man at the counter leaned back slightly, giving her space but maintaining that quiet presence that had become a source of comfort. "You've done more than most people realize," he said, "and you will continue to do more. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Your worth isn't determined by their words, only by the strength and kindness you carry every day." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. The words were simple, yet profound. They affirmed everything she had fought to maintain, everything she had endured, and everything she had quietly achieved. For the first time that day, she felt fully acknowledged, fully seen, fully understood. She returned to her work, but this time her steps felt lighter, her movements steadier. There was a sense of purpose renewed within her, quiet determination that no insult, no judgment, and no cruelty could diminish. She had been recognized for who she truly was, and that recognition was more powerful than any insult could ever be. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the diner, she realized something profound. The world could be cruel, yes, and people could be thoughtless, but there were moments, rare and precious, when someone truly saw you. When someone recognized your courage, your resilience, and your humanity. And in that recognition, there was strength, healing, and hope. The diner around her continued its quiet rhythm, but she felt a change within herself. The morning's cruelty no longer weighed as heavily. Instead, it was replaced by a quiet affirmation of her worth, her strength, and the fact that someone had noticed. Someone had remembered. Someone had acknowledged the truth of who she was. She glanced at the man at the counter. One last time as the evening lights softened around him. He gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of her recognition of his recognition. It was a quiet, wordless exchange that carried more weight than any conversation could. And in that moment, she understood something vital. Dignity, courage, and kindness did not go unnoticed forever. Even when the world seemed harsh. Even when insults and judgments landed hard, someone always saw. And in that seeing, there was validation, there was hope. And there was the quiet reminder that her strength, her resilience, and her humanity mattered. The diner had quieted almost completely. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, soft glow across the room. Only a few stragglers remained, sipping coffee and chatting quietly. She moved between tables, wiping down surfaces, collecting empty cups, and straightening chairs. The day had been long, full of small challenges and the memory of the morning's insults. But now there was a sense of calm, gentle rhythm that gave her a chance to breathe. She glanced toward the counter and saw the man sitting there. He hadn't left. His presence had been steady all day, quiet yet significant, almost like a grounding force she hadn't realized she needed. She approached him cautiously, unsure what to say, yet compelled by a sense of gratitude she couldn't fully articulate. He looked up at her and smiled, a simple, reassuring gesture that felt like an invitation to finally speak freely. "I just want to thank you," she said softly, "for noticing today and for remembering me from before. I've never had anyone see me like that." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't hide it. She wanted to be honest, to let the weight of the day spill out in a way it hadn't been able to. He nodded, his expression calm and understanding. "I meant it," he said. "You've carried yourself through so much with strength and dignity. That matters. It always matters. People may not say it, they may not notice, but it leaves an impression. It shapes the world in ways you can't always see." She took a deep breath and allowed herself to feel the relief that had been building inside all day. The humiliation from the morning, the sting of cruel words, the ache of being judged unfairly, all of it seemed to ease slightly in the warmth of his acknowledgement. She realized that her strength had always been there, but it had felt invisible. Now, someone had truly recognized it. They sat together for a few moments in silence. The diner's gentle hum, the faint smell of coffee, the soft lighting, it all created a space that felt safe, calm, and grounding. She felt a sense of connection she hadn't felt in years. It was not romantic or dramatic. It was something quieter, something deeper, a recognition of humanity, of resilience, of shared understanding. "You know," she began slowly, "I've spent so many years trying to make people see past the surface, trying to show that scars, appearances, and first impressions don't define who someone is. And most of the time, I feel like I fail." Her hands fidgeted slightly with the edge of her apron. "You haven't failed," he said firmly. "Every act of patience, every effort to treat people with dignity, every time you continue, even when the world tries to knock you down, it counts. You may not see it, but it does. And today, I saw it, and I remembered it from before. That matters too." She felt a lump in her throat, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. It was rare, almost unimaginable, for someone to recognize the quiet strength it took to live every day with courage and resilience. She had grown used to the world overlooking her efforts, to the idea that kindness and perseverance often went unnoticed. And yet here was someone who had seen all of it and chosen to acknowledge it. The diner had grown quieter still. The few remaining customers were finishing their meals, chatting softly, and gradually leaving. She moved to clear a table nearby, but she felt lighter than she had all day. The weight of judgment, of insult, of long hours spent being underestimated, it all seemed smaller now, diminished by the knowledge that someone understood. He watched her with a calm, steady gaze. "There's something else I want to tell you," he said quietly. "You've touched more lives than you realize. You may think the small things you do don't matter, but they do. People notice. People remember, and they carry it forward." She paused in surprise, glancing at him. I've never thought of it that way," she admitted. "I've always just tried to keep going day by day, without expecting anything in return." "That's exactly why it matters," he replied. "Because it's genuine, because it's honest, and because it shows what true strength looks like. You don't do it for recognition, and that makes the impact even greater." She felt a quiet swell of pride mixed with relief. All those years of quietly persevering, of maintaining dignity in the face of judgment, of helping others without expecting acknowledgement, it was real. It had meaning. She had carried herself through hardship, yes, but not for applause, not for validation. Only because it was the right thing to do. And now, finally, someone had noticed. The evening light shifted, deepening into soft shades of orange and gold. She moved to the counter to grab a fresh cloth and wipe it down one last time for the day. As she worked, she thought about the morning, the insults, the judgment, and the small moments of kindness that had followed. It was a reminder that life was rarely simple, that cruelty could appear unexpectedly, but that recognition, understanding, and connection could follow too. Often in ways she had never anticipated. The man at the counter stood as she finished wiping the surface. "You've done a lot today," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "And you've done it with grace." "I wanted to make sure you knew that," she smiled. A real smile this time, unguarded and warm. "Thank you," she said again. I needed to hear that more than I realized," nodded, giving her a small, respectful bow of the head. "We all need to be seen sometimes," he said. "And I wanted you to know you've been seen." Her eyes welled slightly with emotion, but she held them back, allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection. All the years of struggling, of being underestimated, of facing unfair judgment, it all felt lighter now. She had been recognized, validated, and respected. And that made every challenge she had faced feel a little less heavy, every insult a little less sharp, and every small act of kindness she had done feel infinitely more meaningful. The diner's evening crowd had nearly cleared. She moved through the space, tidying chairs, wiping tables, and checking that everything was in order for the next day. The hum of the lights, the faint scent of coffee, and the lingering warmth of human connection filled the room. She realized that, despite the morning's difficulties, the day had become something remarkable not because of the insults, but because of recognition, understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement of her worth. Finally, the man at the counter stood to leave. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small notebook, and handed it to her. "I've written some thoughts," he said. "Some encouragement. Some reminders of the strength I've seen in you. I thought you might want to keep it." She took the notebook, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It was small, unassuming, yet heavy with meaning. The pages were filled with notes, observations, and words meant to remind her of her resilience, courage, and the impact she had on others. She felt a quiet warmth in her chest, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and hope. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, tears threatening to fall. This means more than I can explain. You don't need to say anything," he replied gently. "Just remember it. Keep it with you. And know that even on the hardest days, your strength, your courage, and your humanity are noticed. They matter." She nodded, clutching the notebook to her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly seen, truly understood, and truly valued. It was a feeling she had longed for without realizing it. A quiet affirmation that her life, her struggles, and her efforts were meaningful. He gave her one last nod and smiled. "Take care of yourself," he said, and then he left, stepping out into the cool evening air. The door closed softly behind him. Leaving her in the warm glow of the diner, she stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the quiet peace settle over her. The day had been long and challenging, but it had ended in a way she had never expected. Recognition, understanding, and respect had replaced humiliation, judgment, and cruelty. She had been seen, and that changed everything. She walked to the back of the diner, setting down the notebook carefully on a shelf behind the counter. It felt like a symbol of something larger, proof that courage, kindness, and resilience never went unnoticed forever. Even in a world that could be cruel, there were people who recognized the truth of who you were. And that truth, once acknowledged, could change everything. As she turned off the lights and stepped outside, the evening air was cool and refreshing. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of release and renewal. The city was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and she felt lighter than she had in a long time. The day's challenges, the morning's insults, the long hours of work, they all felt smaller now. She had faced them with dignity, and in the end, she had been seen, recognized, and valued. That recognition was more powerful than any insult could ever be, more enduring than any judgment, and more meaningful than any passing moment of cruelty. She walked home slowly, the notebook tucked safely under her arm, feeling a quiet hope and renewed determination. Life would continue to challenge her, but she now carried proof that her strength, resilience, and humanity mattered. That someone had seen her truth, remembered it, and honored it. And that knowledge, that quiet acknowledgement, would carry her through whatever came next.